Sarah had always been the girl everyone underestimated. Growing up in a small farming town in Montana, she was the youngest of 5 children and the only daughter. While her brothers spent their weekends hunting deer and elk in the rugged mountains surrounding their ranch, Sarah was expected to help her mother with cooking and household chores. But Sarah had other plans. Every morning before dawn, while the rest of her family slept, Sarah would sneak out to the old barn where her grandfather's hunting rifle hung on rusty nails. The weapon was ancient, a bolt-action rifle from the 1940s that her grandfather had used during his own military service. Sarah would carefully take it down, check the mechanism, and practice her stance in the dim light filtering through the barn's broken windows. Her grandfather was the only one who knew about her secret practice sessions. He was a quiet man who had served in the Korean War but rarely spoke about his experiences. When he discovered Sarah in the barn one morning, instead of scolding her, he simply nodded and began teaching her the fundamentals of marksmanship. He showed her how to control her breathing, how to find her natural point of aim, and most importantly, how to remain calm under pressure. The other kids at school often mocked Sarah for being different. She was quiet and serious, preferring to spend her time reading military history books rather than gossiping about boys or fashion. Her teachers noticed her exceptional mathematical abilities, particularly in physics and geometry, but they never connected these skills to her growing expertise with firearms. Sarah understood trajectory calculations instinctively, could judge wind speed and direction by watching the movement of grass and leaves, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to estimate distances. When Sarah turned 18, the Iraq War was raging, and military recruiters frequently visited their small town. Most young men from farming families saw military service as an opportunity to see the world and earn money for college. Sarah surprised everyone, including her own family, when she announced her intention to enlist in the army. Her parents were horrified. Her mother cried for days, convinced that the military was no place for a young woman. Her father was more practical in his objections, pointing out that Sarah could easily get a scholarship to study engineering at the state university. But Sarah's mind was made up. She had read countless stories about female soldiers making important contributions to the war effort, and she believed her skills could be useful. During her enlistment interview, when the recruiter asked about her background and interests, Sarah mentioned her experience with firearms. The recruiter, a grizzled sergeant who had seen countless farm kids come through his office, was initially skeptical. Farm kids often claimed to be good shots, but military marksmanship was entirely different from hunting deer. To humor her, the recruiter arranged for Sarah to take an informal shooting test at the local National Guard armory. Using a standard military rifle, Sarah was asked to hit targets at various distances. What happened next surprised everyone present. Sarah consistently hit targets that experienced soldiers struggled with, demonstrating not just accuracy, but also speed and adaptability. Her shots were precise, controlled, and showed a level of technical understanding that typically took years to develop. Word of Sarah's performance spread quickly through military channels. Sniper instructors were always looking for recruits with natural ability, as the intensive training program had a high failure rate. Most candidates were eliminated not because they lacked courage or determination, but because they simply could not master the complex technical skills required for long-range precision shooting. Sarah's combination of mathematical intelligence, physical coordination, and emotional control made her an ideal candidate. However, when Sarah arrived at basic training, she faced immediate challenges that had nothing to do with her shooting abilities. The other recruits, mostly young men from urban backgrounds, were skeptical about a farm girl from Montana. Some made crude jokes about her accent and rural upbringing. Others questioned whether a woman could handle the physical and mental demands of combat. Sarah endured their comments silently, focusing on her training and proving herself through performance rather than words. Her drill sergeants were initially uncertain about how to handle Sarah. Female soldiers were still relatively uncommon in combat roles, and there were no established protocols for integrating women into sniper training programs. Some instructors worried about unit cohesion and the potential complications of having a woman in what had traditionally been an all-male specialty. Others questioned whether Sarah possessed the psychological toughness required for the job. The breakthrough came during advanced marksmanship training. Sarah was competing against the top shooters in her battalion, including several men who had previous military experience. The exercise required hitting multiple targets at varying distances while moving between different firing positions. It was designed to simulate real combat conditions, with time pressure, physical stress, and environmental challenges. Sarah not only completed the course faster than any other recruit, but achieved a perfect score, hitting every target with precision that impressed even the most experienced instructors. Despite her obvious talent, Sarah continued to face resistance from some quarters. A few senior officers expressed concerns about sending a woman into combat situations, citing unit cohesion and the potential for romantic complications. Some argued that the physical demands of carrying heavy sniper equipment over long distances might be too much for a female soldier. Others worried about the psychological impact of killing on a young woman, despite evidence that female soldiers performed just as well as men in combat roles. Sarah's response to these concerns was characteristically direct. She requested additional physical training, often working out before dawn and after regular training hours. She studied military tactics and battlefield psychology, preparing herself not just for the technical aspects of sniping, but for the mental and emotional challenges of combat. She sought out conversations with combat veterans, learning from their experiences and developing strategies for dealing with stress and fear. The final test came during advanced sniper school, where Sarah would either prove herself worthy of deployment or be reassigned to a different military specialty. The training was intense, combining long-range shooting with survival skills, camouflage techniques, and psychological preparation. Students were pushed to their physical and mental limits, with many washing out due to stress, fear, or simple inability to master the required skills. Sarah excelled in every aspect of the training. Her shooting scores were consistently among the highest in her class. Her ability to remain hidden and undetected during surveillance exercises impressed instructors who had been skeptical about her potential. Most importantly, she demonstrated the mental toughness and emotional control necessary for making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. When graduation day arrived, Sarah stood among the select few who had successfully completed one of the military's most challenging training programs. She had earned her place through skill, determination, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. However, she was about to discover that proving herself in training was only the beginning. The real test would come on the battlefields of Iraq, where her skills would be put to the ultimate test. As Sarah prepared for deployment, she received a letter from her grandfather. In it, he shared stories about his own military service that he had never told anyone. He wrote about the importance of staying true to yourself under pressure, about the responsibility that comes with the power to take life, and about the courage required not just to fight, but to make the right decisions when everything is chaos. His words would prove prophetic in the challenges that lay ahead. The helicopter descended through the dusty Iraqi morning, carrying Sarah and her spotter, Corporal James, toward what intelligence reports described as a routine reconnaissance mission. Sarah pressed her face against the small window, watching the desert landscape roll beneath them like an endless brown carpet. After 6 months of deployment, she had grown accustomed to the barren beauty of the Iraqi countryside, but today something felt different. The radio chatter from the cockpit carried an edge of tension that experienced soldiers learned to recognize. Their destination was a small village called Al, approximately 40 kilometers northeast of Baghdad. Intelligence reports suggested that insurgent forces were using the village as a staging area for attacks on coalition supply convoys. Sarah and were tasked with establishing a concealed observation post and gathering information about enemy movements and positions. It was supposed to be a 3-day mission, with extractions scheduled for Thursday morning. The helicopter pilot, a veteran warrant officer named, had flown hundreds of similar missions. As they approached the landing zone, he spoke through the headset communication system. The intelligence briefing had been incomplete, he explained. Recent satellite imagery showed increased activity in the area, and there were unconfirmed reports of a large insurgent force moving through the region. The mission parameters remained unchanged, but wanted them to know that the situation was more volatile than originally anticipated. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Her rifle was a customized M24 sniper weapon system, modified for extended range and enhanced accuracy. She had spent countless hours familiarizing herself with every aspect of the weapon, from its ballistic characteristics to its maintenance requirements. The rifle was equipped with a high-powered scope capable of engaging targets at distances exceeding 1,000 meters. Additionally, she carried a sidearm, communications equipment, surveillance gear, and enough ammunition and supplies for a week-long mission. Was an experienced spotter who had served 3 previous deployments in Iraq. He was responsible for target identification, range estimation, wind calculation, and communication with command headquarters. The partnership between sniper and spotter was crucial for mission success, requiring absolute trust and seamless coordination. During their 6 months working together, Sarah and had developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's methods and capabilities. The helicopter touched down in a dried riverbed approximately 2 kilometers from the village. Sarah and quickly gathered their equipment and moved away from the landing zone as the aircraft departed, leaving them alone in hostile territory. They immediately began moving toward their planned observation post, a rocky outcropping that would provide concealment while offering clear views of the village and surrounding approaches. The journey to the observation post required careful navigation through terrain that offered little natural cover. Sarah moved slowly, using available concealment, and taking frequent breaks to observe their surroundings for signs of enemy activity. The desert heat was intense, even in the early morning hours, and they needed to conserve water while maintaining alertness for potential threats. Upon reaching their position, Sarah spent several hours preparing their hide site. They used natural materials and camouflage netting to create a concealed position that would be virtually invisible from ground level or aerial observation. The hide was positioned to provide optimal fields of fire while offering multiple escape routes if their position was discovered. They established communication procedures and tested their equipment to ensure everything was functioning properly. During their first day of observation, Sarah documented normal village activities. They observed farmers working in fields, children playing in dusty streets, and merchants conducting business in the small market area. Using high-powered optics, they building layouts, potential defensive positions, and civilian movement patterns. The information would be valuable for future operations, but nothing suggested immediate threat activity. However, as afternoon turned to evening, the situation began to change. Sarah noticed unusual movements on the outskirts of the village. Groups of military-aged men were arriving in small trucks and disappearing into specific buildings. The vehicles carried no identifying markings, and the men were dressed in civilian clothing, but their movements and behavior suggested military training. Confirmed Sarah's observations and began documenting the activity for their intelligence reports. By nightfall, it became clear that Al was not the sleepy farming village described in their briefing materials. The insurgent presence was significant and well-organized. Sarah observed weapons being moved into defensive positions, communications equipment being installed, and what appeared to be a command structure being established in the village's largest building. During the night, attempted to establish radio communication with headquarters to report their findings. However, atmospheric conditions and possible enemy jamming prevented reliable contact. They were able to transmit brief status updates, but could not send detailed intelligence reports or request guidance on how to proceed. The communication difficulties left them isolated and dependent on their own judgment for tactical decisions. The second day brought more disturbing developments. Sarah observed through her scope what appeared to be preparation for a major operation. Large quantities of weapons and ammunition were being distributed throughout the village. Improvised explosive devices were being constructed in workshops that had previously appeared to be innocent civilian facilities. Most concerning, Sarah identified what appeared to be mortar positions being established on rooftops and in concealed locations. Plotted the coordinates of enemy positions and calculated ranges and bearing from their observation post. Using his training in artillery and close air support, he estimated that the enemy forces were positioned to attack a major coalition supply route that ran approximately 15 kilometers to the south. The supply route was heavily used by American forces and was defended by a rotating series of patrol bases and checkpoints. Late in the afternoon of the second day, Sarah observed a meeting taking place in the village's central square. Through her scope, she could see men who appeared to be senior leaders discussing what looked like maps and operational plans. One individual, wearing distinctive clothing and clearly in command, was pointing toward the south in the direction of the supply route. Sarah recognized the signs of final operational planning and realized that an attack was imminent. As darkness fell, Sarah faced a critical decision. Their mission orders reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, but the developing situation clearly threatened coalition forces. They attempted repeatedly to establish radio communication with headquarters, but continued to experience technical difficulties. They were witnessing preparation for what could be a devastating attack on American soldiers, but they had no way to warn potential victims or request immediate support. Suggested that they abandon their position and attempt to reach the nearest coalition base to report their intelligence personally. However, this would require traveling approximately 20 kilometers through hostile territory, and there was no guarantee they could arrive in time to prevent the attack. Sarah proposed an alternative, using their position and weapons to disrupt the enemy operation directly. The debate between Sarah and reflected the broader challenges faced by small units operating independently in complex combat environments. Military doctrine emphasized following orders and maintaining communication with higher headquarters, but combat situations often required immediate decisions based on incomplete information and competing priorities. Sarah argued that their primary responsibility was to protect American soldiers, regardless of specific mission parameters. As they watched the village throughout the night, Sarah and observed final preparations for what was clearly going to be a coordinated attack. Enemy fighters were moving into assault positions, weapons were being distributed, and vehicles were being prepared for rapid movement. The scale and sophistication of the operation suggested that the enemy force was much larger and better equipped than intelligence reports had indicated. Just before dawn of the third day, Sarah spotted movement that confirmed her worst fears. A convoy of enemy vehicles was departing the village, heading south toward the coalition supply route. The convoy included technical vehicles mounted with heavy weapons, trucks carrying fighters, and what appeared to be mobile mortar systems. Sarah estimated the enemy force at over 100 fighters, well-armed and organized for a major assault. Immediately attempted emergency radio contact with any coalition forces in the area. After several tries, he managed to establish brief communication with an American patrol base located along the threatened supply route. The radio operator confirmed that a supply convoy was scheduled to pass through their area within the next 2 hours. However, the communication was cut short by apparent jamming and could not provide detailed information about the enemy threat. Sarah realized they were running out of time and options. The enemy force was moving into position to ambush an American convoy, and there was no way to warn the intended victims or call for immediate support. Through her scope, Sarah could see the convoy moving across the desert toward what would certainly be a devastating ambush. She began calculating ranges and wind conditions, preparing for what might be their only opportunity to prevent a disaster. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Iraqi desert as Sarah pressed her eye to the scope, watching the enemy convoy position itself for the ambush. Through the powerful optics, she could see individual fighters checking their weapons and taking cover behind rocks and abandoned vehicles. Lay beside her, frantically working the radio and trying to establish contact with the approaching American supply convoy. Every attempt met with static, or the harsh jamming signals that the insurgents had been broadcasting since before dawn. Sarah's mind raced through the tactical situation. The enemy had positioned themselves along a natural where the supply route passed between two rocky hills. It was a perfect ambush location, offering concealment for the attackers while forcing the convoy into a confined kill zone. She estimated the enemy force at approximately 120 fighters, armed with automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, and at least 3 mortar systems. The American convoy consisted of 12 vehicles, including fuel trucks, supply trailers, and escort vehicles carrying approximately 40 soldiers. Based on standard convoy procedures, the Americans would be expecting possible improvised explosive device threats, but would not be prepared for a coordinated ambush by such a large enemy force. The outcome would be catastrophic unless something changed the tactical equation. Reported his inability to establish communication with either the convoy or higher headquarters. The enemy jamming was sophisticated and effective, isolating them from outside support. He turned to Sarah with a grim expression, recognizing the same conclusion she had reached. They were the only coalition forces in position to influence the developing battle, and their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Sarah began studying the enemy positions through her scope, looking for targets that might disrupt the planned ambush. Standard sniper doctrine emphasized targeting enemy leaders, communications personnel, and weapons operators. However, the range to most enemy positions exceeded 3,000 meters, far beyond the effective range of her rifle and scope system. Even with perfect conditions, engaging targets at such distances would be extremely difficult and unlikely to achieve decisive results. But Sarah noticed something that changed her assessment of the situation. Approximately 3 miles from her position, positioned on a hilltop overlooking the ambush site, was what appeared to be the enemy command post. Through her scope, she could identify several figures who appeared to be directing the overall operation. More importantly, she spotted what looked like communications equipment and possibly a mortar fire direction center. Confirmed Sarah's observation and began calculating the exact range using his laser rangefinder and survey equipment. The distance measured 5,280 meters, exactly 3 miles. This was far beyond the normal engagement range for their weapon system, requiring ballistic calculations that pushed the limits of both equipment and human capability. Pulled out his ballistic computer and began working through the complex mathematics required for such an extreme-range shot. The environmental conditions were challenging, but not impossible. The morning air was relatively stable, with light winds that estimated at 5 to 8 miles per hour from the southeast. Temperature and humidity readings were within acceptable parameters for long-range shooting. However, the extreme distance meant that minor errors in calculation or execution would result in complete misses, and they would likely have time for only 1 or 2 shots before their position was detected. Completed his calculations and began briefing Sarah on the shooting solution. The bullet would take approximately 7 seconds to reach the target, during which time it would arc high above the desert floor before descending toward the enemy position. Gravity would drop the bullet nearly 200 feet during its flight, requiring Sarah to aim at a point far above her intended target. Wind drift would push the bullet several feet to the left, requiring additional compensation. Sarah studied the target area through her scope, identifying the specific individual she planned to engage. The target appeared to be the senior enemy commander, positioned next to what looked like radio equipment and surrounded by subordinates. Taking out the commander and destroying the communications gear might disrupt the enemy's coordination enough to give the American convoy a fighting chance. The technical challenges of the shot were immense. At 3 miles, the target appeared as little more than a small dot in Sarah's scope, requiring her to estimate the exact center of mass and adjust for the target's potential movement during the bullet's 7-second flight time. The rifle and ammunition were operating at the extreme limits of their capabilities, with bullet velocity and accuracy degrading significantly at such distances. Sarah controlled her breathing and settled into her natural point of aim, a shooting position she had practiced thousands of times during training. Called out final wind and range corrections, monitoring environmental conditions for any last-minute changes. The enemy commander was standing relatively still, apparently studying a map or giving instructions to subordinates. Just as Sarah was preparing to fire, spotted movement in the distance that added urgency to their situation. The American convoy had appeared on the horizon, approximately 15 minutes away from entering the ambush zone. If Sarah was going to take the shot, it had to be now. There would be no time for adjustments or follow-up attempts. Sarah squeezed the trigger with the smooth, steady pressure that had been drilled into her during countless training sessions. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder, and she immediately began tracking the bullet's flight path through her scope. At extreme range, she could actually follow the bullet's trajectory as it arced across the desert sky toward its target. 7 seconds felt like an eternity as Sarah watched through her scope, waiting to see the results of her shot. Was already preparing for a possible follow-up shot, though they both knew their position would likely be compromised after the first round. The bullet covered the 3-mile distance, dropping toward the enemy command post with mathematical precision. The impact was devastating and immediate. Sarah's bullet struck the enemy commander center mass, killing him instantly and destroying the radio equipment positioned nearby. The effect on the enemy force was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. Without their commander and communications capability, the carefully coordinated ambush began falling apart. Enemy fighters started looking toward the command post, trying to understand what had happened. Some began moving away from their assigned positions to investigate. The disciplined formation that had been prepared to devastate the American convoy began dissolving into confusion and uncertainty. Immediately began packing their equipment as Sarah provided security. They knew that enemy forces would soon be searching for the source of the shot that had killed their commander. The hide site that had concealed them for 3 days would no longer provide safety once the enemy organized a systematic search of the surrounding area. As they prepared to leave their position, Sarah and could hear the distant sound of gunfire from the direction of the convoy route. The American supply convoy had entered the ambush area, but instead of facing a coordinated attack by a disciplined enemy force, they encountered scattered resistance from confused and disorganized fighters. The convoy's escort vehicles were able to suppress enemy fire and continue moving through the danger area. Sarah and began their extraction movement, traveling cross-country toward a pre-planned rendezvous point where they could signal for helicopter pickup. The journey would take several hours through hostile territory, but the success of Sarah's shot had significantly reduced the enemy threat in their immediate area. During their movement to the extraction site, was finally able to establish radio contact with coalition forces. He reported the successful disruption of the enemy ambush and requested immediate pickup. The radio operator confirmed that the supply convoy had successfully passed through the threatened area with minimal casualties, thanks to the confusion created by the loss of enemy leadership. The helicopter extraction went smoothly, with Sarah and safely aboard the aircraft within 6 hours of taking their dramatic shot. As they flew back toward their base, Sarah reflected on the events of the past 3 days and the shot that had saved potentially dozens of American lives. Post-mission analysis confirmed the accuracy and effectiveness of Sarah's shooting. The 5,280-meter shot was later as one of the longest combat sniper engagements in military history. More importantly, intelligence reports indicated that the disrupted ambush had been planned as part of a larger enemy operation that could have resulted in significant coalition casualties. Sarah's success silenced the critics who had questioned whether a woman could handle the physical and psychological demands of combat sniping. Her technical skill, tactical judgment, and courage under pressure had proven that effectiveness in combat depended on ability and character rather than gender. The shot that saved the battalion became a defining moment not just in Sarah's military career, but in the broader acceptance of women in combat roles. The recognition that followed included both official military decorations and informal respect from fellow soldiers who understood the significance of what Sarah had accomplished. However, Sarah herself remained focused on the mission and the lives that had been saved rather than the personal accolades. She had proven that when training, skill, and courage come together under pressure, extraordinary things become possible. Years later, when military historians analyzed the engagement, they would point to Sarah's shot as an example of how individual soldiers can influence the outcome of much larger military operations. The 3-mile shot that eliminated enemy leadership and saved an entire battalion demonstrated that in modern warfare, the actions of a single skilled soldier could have strategic implications far beyond their immediate tactical situation.